What are we going to look into today? The schedule. First of all, when to use splits. How do splits work? Setting up splits, probably most important. Setting up how to set up splits. Understanding split data. So what fields can we call if we want to create a nice output list, for example, or a nice certificate. Using splits and results together. And last but not least, some tips and tricks. I would rather say it's some hints rather than tips and tricks. So when are we doing the splits? Probably not in the office between two desks, but whenever you have a defined start and finish, you can use the splits functionality, the splits features. Another prerequisite is that all participants in the same contest complete the same course on the same distance. There are a few events where participants can do different courses. And of course, if you want to make it easy, you can always make things complex with result 12, but you can keep them as easy as possible. And that's why we implemented, or that's why we came up with the splits functionality to make your life as easy as possible as well. But to give you some more concrete examples on when it's possible to use splits. So first of all, a classic running event with a shared start and finish. It also works with a separate start and finish, but at least as long as you have a fixed start and a fixed finish line and an indefinite number of splits in between. It also works, for example, for an open water swim with fixed number of laps. Actually, it works with any event with a fixed number of laps. A triathlon with a rolling start also works with the splits. A cycling sportive, a Gran Fondo, that also works with the splits. But event or types of events that do not work with the splits is, for example, a run with overlapping start and finish, or any event with overlapping start and finish, as we see currently with COVID-19. Especially with short distances, you can have events where participants start, let's say, over the course of an hour. But if you have a 5K or 10K race, obviously the first participants will finish before the last ones have started into their race. And in that special case, it is not possible to use the splits. There you need to use the advanced results. For a mountain bike enduro, for example, where you have stages or where you have several short races, short stages, it's also not possible. Where for cycling crit race, where you have an indefinite number of laps, where it's not clear right away when will we reach the finish line, that is not possible to use the splits. Yeah, just with any other event, a 6-hour lap race, for example, does not work with splits. Well, you can use the splits functionality, but it is not meant to be used for such an event. But how do the splits work in general? So what do we need to know in order to use the splits? Actually, there's basically only two things that we need to know, that we need to be aware of. The first thing is where, and the second is when. So where will we receive a detection or a time for a participant? Or in other words, which timing point will record a time for the participant? And optionally, what distance into the race is this? The second question, when? So what is the earliest time a participant can be recorded here? Why do we need the earliest time? We simply want to make sure that we catch cheaters, or that we catch people standing on a line with their bib, but they haven't actually taken place in the, they didn't take part in the race. So we want to try to ignore those detections that are not valid, that are not, that cannot be true. And therefore we use the minimum time or a fastest speed or pace, but we will see a few more options later on. So this is all we need to know about what do we need for splits. You don't need to know much more in order to set up your splits. Another option, and we will look into the software later on, is the scoring mode. The scoring mode defines whether to use gun time or chip time, but only for primary scoring. With splits, you can always call either gun time or chip time, doesn't matter. But for primary scoring or for default times, default rankings with the splits, you define which one to use. So either gun time, and the gun time then is always based on the participant's start time, which is T0. If you have a wave start, then of course the T0 is different for participants even of the same contest. But you can also score based on chip time, and the chip time is always calculated by the settings of the splits, and it refers to the split with the type of sport. This is the start. You will see that in a bit. And if you have several splits using the type of sport, this is the start, then the chip time will be calculated from the last split using this type of sport. Last but not least, you can also set a filter. And if that filter is true, the participant will be scored on gun time. If that filter is not true, participant will be scored on chip time. So for example, if you want to score top 10 participants on gun time and everyone else on chip time, you can use that filter. But, and this is really important, this must not reference any field which relies on split data or on any detections. So it must not reference a dynamic field. It needs to reference a fixed field, like for example, in a checkbox additional field, because otherwise you will end up with a circular reference, and that may lead to even more issues with your file. Looking back at the example of top 10 participants being scored on gun time, well, what I used to do is usually either you sit right at the finish line, or you have someone sitting there being able to take notes. Hopefully you will double check the top 10 finishes and write down their bib numbers anyway on a notepad or so. And for those participants, you can manually check this checkbox field, either through data manipulation, or you go into every single participant and check the box. Because then you can apply this filter, and you could say, for example, set the filter to top 10 finisher equals 1. And that way, that filter can be used. This is the prerequisites to know, to be aware of when setting up splits. But now let's have a look at how to set them actually up, or how to set them up. This screenshot is taken from our major marathon template. The major marathon template includes start, splits, and a finish. And we have a split every 5K. And we additionally have an announcer 100 meters before the finish line. So every line, or actually every pair of 2 lines, stands for one split, or represents one split. So we have these 2 lines, this block for the start split. We have this block for the 5K split. We have this block for the 10K split, and so on and so on. But let's have a look at the split structure when setting it up. First of all, we have the name on the furthest left. The name here, 5K, is a unique field name that is used to call the split. And this field name should really be unique throughout the event file. This doesn't mean that within the splits you need to have different field names for the same split. If you have, for example, the marathon race, but in your event you also have a half marathon and you also have a 10K, and they all pass the 5K mark, then of course you can call that field name 5K for all 3 contests. But if you look at any other setting, like a advanced result, a ranking, a team score, a user-defined field, an additional field, for example, there you must not use the same field name. So that's what we mean with unique here in this example when looking at splits. How do you name that field? It makes sense that for the name, you give a concise name. So define where the split is or what it's doing. So anybody who's working with that file knows right away, okay, this is the 5K. And this is, I don't know, at the corner, 2nd Street, 5th Avenue, whatever. So you can also call the name, or you can give it the name 2nd, 5th Avenue, whatever. It doesn't need to be clear to the participant where that split is, because you can optionally also give a label for a display in results or on myraceresult.com. And the label, of course, should be clear to the participant. The second setting is the timing point. Quite obvious, you decide which timing point data should be used for this split. And you can also optionally define a backup timing point and then also give an offset. And only if you don't receive a detection from your main timing point, the software will take a detection from the backup timing point and apply the offset, which can be negative or positive, depending on where you set up your backup timing point. So sometimes you have a backup a few meters before the 5K mark. Sometimes you have it a few meters behind the 5K mark. So that way you can regulate that a bit. And here it is only important to know for the backup timing point. Actually, there's 2 points that are important when looking at the backup timing point. There's 2 options. So if you have 2 systems, if you have 2 independent systems, you can either write data from both systems into the same timing point, but that is not as precise as having them write data into separate timing points. Why? If you have them, or if you write data in the same timing point, you never know if someone got the data, or you know, but the software doesn't really know or doesn't really make anything out of it, if the detection comes from the main timing point or the backup timing point. And if you have 2 separate timing points and you define the backup timing point here in your splits, then only, as said, only if you don't have a detection from your main timing point, it will use the backup timing point data. And then, of course, if you wanna, or if you want to create some statistics, some read rates, whatever, then you have some more options as well. So that's the backup timing point. The third option is the type of sport. And the type of sport, there's only one type of sport that really matters. And that is the type of sport called "this is the start." So with "this is the start," you define the start split for the chip time, as we've seen on a previous slide. Or if you choose any other type of sport, then it will provide suggested min-max values for the column on the most right. But the type of sport, for example, running or cycling, doesn't play a big role. As said, it will provide a suggestion for the min-max values that we will look at in a bit. And it will also define the default pace or speed that will be used for an average that we will also see later. But that's all. There's nothing more to the type of sport. The fourth option for the split structure is the distance. Apparently, you define the distance on course. And for every split, you can define the distance either from the start or from any other previous split. You can define it in meters, kilometers, miles. I think that's the 3 options. And it's really up to you. And the distance is not mandatory, but When you want to work with a pace or a speed calculation, then the distance is necessary. And I also prefer, or I recommend, adding it. As long as you know where the system will be set up, enter the data, just for the sake of completeness. And the last setting here is the minimum and maximum values, either speed, pace, or time values. And why do we need them? Because that way we can create a valid time window for any given split. It's easy as that. We want to ignore catches, or we want to cheaters. We want to catch cheaters, or we simply don't want that people cutting short the course will get a valid detection, and that's the only way how to catch them actually. When looking at the min max, we have a few different options. So either we refer to a fixed time, which can either be the race time, so the time from T0, or the time of day. So we could, for example, say the 5K split is only valid if it has a time that is between 15 minutes and an hour 30 from T0, race time. Or the 5K split is only valid if it has a detection between 5 p.m. and 6:30, which would be the time of day. But we can also define it relatively to a previous split. So we can either say the time from the previous split, like 15 to 30 minutes, for example. Or we can also define that relative time as a pace or a speed. And here it's only necessary to know that a minimum pace, or a small pace, or a small value for the pace, is a high speed. The lower the pace, the faster the participant. Opposite to the speed, where obviously high speed means fast participant. And you can also define your minimum time frame from any other previous split. So let's look at least 2 or 3 different splits that we set up in our example. So let's look at the start. We defined the name start. This is obvious. You usually know where the start line is. We don't provide any deviating label here. We take the start timing point. We don't have any backup because there's only one line. And then we choose the type of sport. This is the start, which will always take the last read within this time frame. And if you select this is the start, then you cannot select a distance, because the software knows that usually if you start, you are exactly 0 meters into the race. There are options to select or to have a split prior to the start. For example, a swim check for a triathlon. And that's why you can also enter negative times here. So for the start, we say 5 seconds before the gun fires up until 2 minutes after the gun fires. Then for the 5K, again, pretty obvious. Our split name is 5K. Our split timing point is 5K timing point. Actually, the timing point is really the only field out of the splits which can have the same name. But anyway, I recommend to have them separate. So usually we say it's best practice to have the timing points all capital letters. But obviously for a split name called 5K, that doesn't really make sense. But if you would call it 5K split, for example, then that would be a bit clearer. The type of sport is running. And if you select running, by default, you will receive a pace that is between 230 per kilometer and 20 minutes per kilometer. If you choose cycling, for example, then you will have a speed. Then you will have by default, I think, between 5 and 60 kilometers per hour. I'm sorry for the Americans watching. I don't have it in mind what it is in miles per hour or miles, minutes per mile. Not sure how that will convert. But if I would simply change that value, these numbers should convert automatically. And the distance, here we say 5,000 meters from the start. Obviously, for the first split, we can't select anything other than the start. For the 10K, we could also say 5,000 meters from previous split. So the 10K, exactly the same setup as the 5K. And also the finish is nothing else than any other split. So we don't say this is the finish, like we do with this is the start. We do that at a different place in the software, and we will talk about that in, let's say, 3 minutes from now. What else can we set up? Legs. So legs may span multiple splits. In our example, a first 10K, the second 10K, the third 10K, and the fourth 10K. The same applies, the same as we've seen for its splits, also applies here. We give a name, which is internal, and we can give a label, which can also be multilingual. And then we simply define what timing points to consider for that leg. So we say from which split to which split we want to calculate our leg. And obviously for the first 10K, we calculate the time from start T0 to the 10K split timing point. And the distance will automatically be calculated from the data that we provided here. A very good example usually for legs is triathlon legs. You have the swim, bike, run, and you have the transition zone in between. But if you have consecutive splits, so for a triathlon, for example, if you really only have a swim out, or swim in, bike out, bike in, run out, finish, then you don't need to set up legs. Because for every split, automatically you will be able to call the last sector. So if you can always call with a 5K, that's not the best example, but with a 10K, you can always also call the last sector, which would be the 10K, which would be 5K to 10K. We will look at that a bit later. So if you only have consecutive splits, you don't need to set up legs, but here it makes sense because the 5K, 15K, 25K, 35K are in between. So we span multiple splits. And now we have a start and a finish result that we can define. We define that in the main window in the contest settings. And by default, the finish result is set to automatic last split. And that's what I meant when I said here for the finish, we don't need to tick any box or choose a type of sport like we do for the start, which says this is the start. We don't need that for the finish. But here in our start and finish results, we can select that, and then it will be used for some default fields in the software. And also the start result, by choosing the type of sport, this is the start, it will only be used for the chip time calculation, but not for anything else in the software. So for any default fields, we use the start result automatic first split. If you have a swim check, for example, which should not be used as the start result, or not necessarily a swim check, but any other sort of check, which is not the real start of the race, where there is another detection, then you can also choose any other split that is set up in the software. So let's have a quick look at the software. I simply set up a file based on our major marathon template. And then I created one participant. So how does it look like? We go into main window and we go to the splits, which are under scoring settings. Now for every contest, we can define the splits. So you see for the 10K, we only have a start, a 5K, announcer, and finish. For the half marathon, we have start, 5K, blah, blah, 20K, announcer, finish. And marathon, we have a split every 5K. On top, you see the time mode, the scoring mode that I referred to. So either score by gun time, score by chip time, or score by chip time unless this filter matches. And as said, this is only being used for primary scoring. You can always call either gun time or chip time if you want to have any other additional scoring options. And then we have our start, splits, and finish. And we also have our legs. If you have a ton of different contests, you don't need to set them up, which with a very similar layout, you don't need to set them up all from scratch. You can always copy from any other contest that you have prepared so far. And you can export your split settings and import them into another file. So that's quite handy, quite easy to set up. And yeah, that's why we said we want to make it as easy as possible. We want to make your life as easy as possible. So now you know how to set up splits. So you only need to know where is my system, when can I expect detections, and you define the order. That's actually more or less all. And I would say everyone who wants to time a race should know these things anyway. But what else can we add to the splits? So understanding split data can be a bit confusing because there is quite a lot of data. So when looking at the participant results here, for a participant that did a marathon with a split every 5K, we have quite a large table here. And the table includes the time of day of the detection, the gun time at this split, the chip time at this split, the rank after that split, the sector time, what I just said. So the 10K sector was 33 minutes here. And then also a speed or a pace by default based on the type of sport. And for the ranks, you can choose between overall rank, gender rank, and age group rank used here by, or you can choose the selection by the drop down on the top right. And then the same also holds true for the legs. So we have our leg. Obviously, we don't have a time of day and we don't have a gun time because we look at 2 splits and then we take the time between 2 splits. So we have the rank, we have the total time for that split, and we again have the speed or pace. The rank shown here is always the rank after a split. So not for the sector. But you can also call the sector rank. We will look at how to access the fields actually right now. So this is just the first slide on that topic or in that matter. So we will see that in a bit. So when accessing split fields in an output list, for example, for a live results table or in a certificate, you can always call the split time according to the scoring settings, so either gun time or chip time, by simply calling the split name. So if you enter 5K, you will receive the gun time, as long as your primary scoring is set to gun time. You can call the last split with those curly brackets, and then it will always provide the time at the last recorded split. And you can also use the selector dropdown, and then the time shown will always depend on the selected split from the selector in the top right. But that's by far not the end. So let's have a look at different split time fields. So this is the description and this is the example. So the split name.tod. So if you type 5k.tod, it will return 935.37. But you can also always call 5k.gun or 5k.chip, no matter what primary scoring option you use. And you can also call 5k.sector. Obviously, for 5k, the sector doesn't really make sense because here the sector is the same as the chip time. For a 10k sector, that would work. And the chip time will default to gun time if there's no start detection. That's correct. Another thing is split ranks. We talked about them, but now let's have a look at them. So if you call split name.overall, you will receive your overall ranking with a grouping by contest. If you call the split name.gender, or even in the participant window, if you select the overall ranking or the gender ranking, then with a gender ranking, you will have a grouping by contest and gender. And with the age group ranking, you will have a ranking grouped by contest, gender, and age group 1. At the moment, it's not possible to call age group 2 or 3, and it's also not possible to reference any other fields or any other groupings. So we only have those 3 main and default rankings available. But you can also combine those rankings. So you could also call split name.sector.age group, and then you would receive the age group rank of that sector of the split name or of that split that you mentioned or that you've given. For the split ranks, it's important for you to know that they do not consider status. So for official ranks, if you use the status field for official ranks, please use the rankings, the dedicated rankings, or use the auto rank if you only publish any lists. If you publish lists and certificates, I personally prefer rankings because then you can be sure that people have the same rank on the certificate and the output list. But of course, if you do everything correct, the auto rank gives you much more flexibility with output lists and still will provide the same number, the same ranking. But I told you we are by far not at the end of data split data fields. There is much more. And actually almost everything here can be connected by the dot logic. So let's have a look at the time formatting first. So if you extend your expression by dot decimal, so for example, 5k.tod.decimal would return your 5k split time of day as a decimal value. You can also call predicted times. We will look at predicted times on the next slide. You can, by extending expression, define the rank format. You can add a dot. You can have it first, second, third, and so on. Dot max allows you to call the total number of ranks at that moment, or the total number of participants in that ranking. You can call gap times, either to the previous participant or to the first participant. And with the gap times, it makes sense that you call the ranking first. So for example, 10K dot overall dot gap dot next pref, for example. Gap pref, I think it's called. You will always also find all information in the knowledge base, especially about those data fields and how to connect them. Then you see .exists and .positive. And what's the difference between the two? As I told you, there might be some splits that may hold negative values, like a swim check. A swim check usually takes place before the start time. But that gives you a negative value. So .positive, what we used to have with the advanced results, does not work in this case. So that's why we came up with another field that's called .exists. So .exists is positive if there is a time stored in this split. And .positive is true if the time is positive, as the name says. Then we also have the split count. And the split count counts how many splits hold a time up until the split that you call. So if you call finish.split count, and you have a total number of 13 splits, then that number should be 13 for everyone who has a time in every single split. If a participant missed 2 splits, for example, then finish.split count would return 11. You can also call the distance of a split as long as you provided it in your split setup. And by adding .meter, .kilometer, .miles, you can call the speed of that split, of that leg, of that sector, or the pace, or the speed or pace. And the speed or pace depends on your setting on that split. So by default, it will use the default setting of the type of sport. So I said for running, it will take minutes per kilometer. For cycling, it will be kilometers per hour. You can call the name or the label of that split. So if you type 5K, it will return the time. If you type 5K.name, it will return 5K. If you return 5K.label, it will return the label that you provided for the 5K. The order position should really only be used for sorting. The order position, the number doesn't tell you anything. It only makes sure that splits are in the correct order. .next, .pref, .top, .last, you can use them for the gap times. Or you can also call any participant data from any participant based on any ranking. So you can, for example, if you want to know for or assuming you have a LED wall, and you also always want to show the current finisher and the previous finisher, then you could, in the first line for the current finisher, show name and the split finish time. And for the previous finisher, you could call finish dot TOD for time of day, because you want to have the previous finisher no matter when he started his race. So finish dot TOD dot pref for the previous finisher dot name, or first name, first last name. So that way you can call the first last name of the previous finisher based on the time of day, based on the finish time. So that's what you also can use the next, pref, top, and last for. Unfortunately, or maybe not unfortunately, I'm not sure what you would want to make use of with that. The split count.max does not exist. I guess you want to automate the calculation to have a formula that automatically, no matter how many splits you set up, calculates if there's a split missing or not. Actually, I could imagine that there will be quite a few people who would be using that, so I will take a note and I will add that to the wish list. Of course, that way you could automate as much as possible in your general setup and have it as generalized as possible. So the next thing, and I briefly talked about it, is predicted splits. With the splits functionality, we will also, or the software will also always provide a prediction. And a prediction is based on the percentage of the fastest possible split time. So we said we have a maximum possible pace of 230 per kilometer. So the 20K can be reached earliest after 50 minutes, and the 25K can be reached earliest after an hour, 2 minutes, roughly. But here we have a gun time of 3 hours 27, and we have a trend. So that's far more than 50 minutes. So this is a percentage of, let's say, this is 4 times the best possible time. So the next split will also be roughly 4 times the maximum or the best possible time for the 25K. And it also looks at trends across splits. So if you have, for example, if you slow down during the race compared to the best possible time, then it will also correct your prediction or your predicted times further down here. And the predicted splits with the plus sign, you can use that to automatically create a manual time. We will look at that in a bit as well. And the predicted splits can also be used and accessed as a time of day, gun, chip, or sector time. And why would you need it? Imagine you're at a large race, a marathon, and you want to cheer for a friend, but you don't know when he will come to the finish line. But now with a prediction, you could have in your live list, you could always show the predicted finish time as a time of day. So the friends of any runner can see, okay, he is expected at the finish line at around 4:48. So no need to wait there at 4 p.m. already. And now let's have a quick look at the software. So how does it look like in the software? So we've just seen it, but how can you check that your setup is perfect? Can you check that your setup is correct? So first of all, you can use the race simulation. And in the race simulation, if you choose a contest, it will automatically populate your times to generate based on the splits that you set up. And also the min time and the max time, they will be based on the settings in your splits. So now I will generate all times. I have one participant in my database. And now let's have a look at this participant. So there you see me. Okay, here now we have all data that we've just seen on a screenshot on a previous slide. We have our split name, time of day, gun time, chip time, rank, sector time, and the speed. And here we also have our legs and the leg times and the speed for that leg. Luckily, I won the race. That doesn't happen often. So now let's have a look at what happens if we miss a split. So now I will untick the 25K detection. And now I will see it's grayed out because there's no time available. What we can now do, or so this is not an extrapolation, but an interpolation, because it takes those two times, before and after, and then simply checks, okay, what time must he have been, or must the participant have been here? And when clicking on the plus icon, you can then either enter a time of day, or a gun time, or a chip time. And if you hit enter, that will automatically create a manual timing raw data entry. So no need to calculate anything, and you type into timing raw data, the timing point and the time, and so on and so forth. So that is quite handy. Now let's untick the others as well. And now you have, or now we see the predicted times here. And assuming that he lost his transponder after 20K, but we know this guy and we know he finished, then we wouldn't need to populate all splits in between, but we could simply say, okay, he was at the finish after 4 hours, 7 minutes, or the time of day. Okay, the race started at midnight, so time of day in gun is the same. But that way he would still have a finish time, but no splits in between, and that is still valid. Okay, I hope that was all clear when looking at the splits data and how to make use of it. Because then the next thing I'm going to talk about is combining splits and results. For example, if you want to add a penalty to your finish time, there is no option to add a penalty within the splits, but you can use the advanced results for that. So here we set up result 1, T1, called final time, which uses the calculation T2 plus NZ T3. And that simply means use 0 if T3 is empty, or if there's no value for T3. T2 is our finish gun time, which uses finish.gun.decimal. We could also only write finish.decimal as long as our scoring mode is set to gun time. But we prefer to write the full expression here, because that way you always know, okay, this uses the gun time, no matter what scoring option you used. And it's also recommended that you use square brackets around here, which are not here on the screenshot. So whenever you call any field within your advanced results, please use square brackets. And how does it look like in the results? So here we have our finished gun time after 7 hours, 53 minutes, 45 seconds. And we add a penalty of 2 minutes. So our final time would be 7:55, 45 seconds. And in this case, it's only necessary to also set the finish result to result ID 1 and not the automatic last split. Simply because the penalty usually plays a crucial role in the total time. So that was it on combining splits and advanced results. And that then leads us to the last section, which is the tips and tricks, or rather hints, as I told you. First of all, splits must be consecutive. So you need to set up your splits in a consecutive order. So it doesn't make sense to set up your finish result first, then the start, then the 5K, then the 15K, then the 10K. That doesn't really make any sense. So set up your splits in the order a participant completes the race. So a split time must be after the previous split. That sounds odd because that sounds logical. But with the advanced results structure, you sometimes had a different setup. And with the advanced results, that didn't necessarily matter. But with the splits, that matters. And be careful with missed splits. For example, announcer and finish, but actually all missed splits. Because as we've just seen in this example, we can still have a valid finish time, even though a participant does not have any detections in between. And how does that work? So when we look at our splits setup, let's have a look at a 20K split, for example. So first of all, the software checks, okay, what is the time frame for a valid 20K detection based on the start and the minimum pace speed time, maximum pace speed time for the 20K. So the participant needs to have a 2:30 per kilometer pace to 20 minutes per kilometer pace for 20 kilometers from the start. And as said before, that will be a valid time frame for a valid 20K detection between 50 minutes and what was it? I don't remember. Let me quickly calculate. An hour 40 multiplied with 4, 6 hours. I think around 6 hours. So any detection at the 20K mark that is between 50 minutes and 6 hours is still a valid detection. So it doesn't necessarily need to have a detection at every single split, as you may set it up with your raw data rules. There you can really set it up in a way that you need to have a detection at every single split. That's not the case here. It does not rely on a split, on a detection at every single split. But it looks at the valid time frame, not only from the previous, but from the start and the previous detections. If a participant, for example, has a detection at the 30K that is not valid at the 30K, then has a detection at a 20K at a valid point in time, then the software would still use the 20K detection. So if you have people running around with their transponders in hand, then you need to be cautious. Okay, if you have a valid 30K detection and then a valid 20K detection afterwards, then it's an interesting question. I can't tell you, but we can simply check what happens. So we say we have a valid detection at the 20K, and we say we have a valid detection at the 30K, but that happened after, can be earliest, I think an hour 45. Okay, down, let's say for the 20K, we have 3 hours 12. And let's take this one out. So here it would take the 20K detection. Even though the 30K was first. But it depends on how many detections you have in between. So of course, if someone would have something like this, like a start detection, then a 30K detection, and a 20K detection, he would probably be at the very end of the leaderboard. So it wouldn't be too much of an issue, at least with live results. But if you have such a scenario, if you have an example where things seem to be wrong, then let us know, send an email to support@result, and we will look into it. The second hint I want to give to you is the internal splits. So internal splits are not shown on my result or called in the last split or the selector. And where can I find them? In the details for this split, you can define the type of your split. Then you can also define the unit for speed and pace if you want to have any deviating units. If you don't want to rely on the automatic unit, but you want to decide what unit to use. And the internal split is useful for announcer or cheat points on course, because obviously cheat points, the participant should not know that there is a cheat point, but you as a timer, you want to know, and the organizer might want to know as well. Or the announcer also doesn't play a huge role for the participant. And then last but not least, the announcer line. It really makes sense that we talk about that. So if using the speed or a pace as the maximum time, you need to be cautious. The shorter the distance, the more accuracy is required. Especially with the announcer line, you often don't know if it is 30 meters from the finish line, 50 meters from the finish line, 70 meters, 100 meters. And if you then use the pace, it can become an issue. So let's look at the bottom two lines here. You have a distance of 50 meters or 40 meters, and you have the same pace, but there's almost already 2 seconds of a difference. So that can be quite difficult when using the announcer line. So a good alternative is to use the time from the previous split. So let's look at the split setup again with the announcer. Now we know, okay, this is 100 meters from the finish line. So we know that after someone has been detected at the announcer, he needs to, I think it's 25 seconds or so, or 15 seconds until he can have a valid detection at the finish line, or a maximum of 2 minutes. But sometimes that doesn't fit, because a participant talks to the announcer or whatever, he proposes to his soon-to-be wife, whatever, or to his girlfriend, and that takes time, but he still reaches the finish line at one point. So then you can also say relative time from previous split, and simply say, okay, I don't know where exactly my announcer is located, my announcer mat, but I know that participants will need minimum 10 seconds up to 20 minutes, because I know things can happen. And that way we know that we will definitely have a valid finish time, no matter how far the announcer will be from our finish line. And that was it for the splits and about the splits and what you can do with them, how you can make use of them, how you can benefit from them for your lists, how you can call several data fields. Now it's still some time for your questions and to comment on the last message in the chat. Yeah, for someone passing a point on the way home, for example, of course, it depends when he leaves. So if he stops running after 10K and then passes the 30K mark, then of course it depends on if he fits the time frame. It can be, I don't want to say it can be critical, but of course you can have a valid detection for someone, for example, leaving the race early and going home. that can happen if you have a 30K valid 30K detection, and then you will have another valid 20K detection. And then I'm not sure if you only have to start in the 30K and the 20K, how that will really be. So if we take that out for the 20K, then it would use the 30K. Yeah, I think actually I would need to check the code. I would need to check with the developers, but I think it will always take the earliest possible split that fits the time frame. So whenever you have, when you don't have a 5K, 10K split, but a 15K, and then after the 15K, you will have a 5K that would still fit the time frame, then it would take that for the 5K. But if you have a ton more of detections, valid detections from different splits, then it would probably ignore the 5K. So it's not that easy to simply say yes or no. It will ignore or it will not ignore the detection from a previous split that was missed before. So it depends on how many splits you have in total, I think. I would need to check more thoroughly, or you check, but I think it's like that. So the software is a bit smart as well. So it really depends. Of course, the more splits you have, the more reliable it is. To answer the other question, how do you call the current leg or the current sector an athlete is on? So you have, or we have the last split. And the last split is the last split that someone has a time in. So you could also say last split dot pref dot next, sorry, last split dot next dot name or dot label. That would be the name of the next split someone will reach. Maybe you can make something out of that. Or you will use a user-defined field for it, which we will look at next week. User-defined fields, expressions, functions. We will look at that next week, because you can also make use of it if you want to call the current an athlete is on. I hope that answered your question. And then if there's no more questions for now, all I can say is thanks for tuning in. I hope you took something out of that session again, and I'm happy to welcome you next week at the same time as today, when we will look at user-defined fields or fields in general, functions, expressions. So stay tuned, stay healthy, and enjoy the time. And you will see me and hear me next week. Thanks again, and bye-bye, everyone.